A missing passenger list was strange enough, but the unfinished sentence hidden inside her bag was what sent the cowboy into the mountains. Snow whipped across Garrett Hayes' face as he stumbled into the abandoned cabin. The door slammed behind him with a hollow crack. On the table sat a single oil lamp, long cold. Beside it lay a folded letter written in the same careful handwriting he'd memorized for months. His gloves trembled as he opened it. Then he saw the date. 3 days ago. Outside, fresh tracks disappeared into the white wilderness, and suddenly, nothing made sense anymore. If stories of courage and unexpected love speak to you, stay with us and share where you're watching from. Winter settled hard over the Absaroka Range in the closing weeks of 1886. Snow covered the hills around Cedar Bluff Ranch until the fences looked like pale lines drawn across a blank page. The cottonwoods along the creek stood bare and silent. Every morning, Garrett Hayes woke before sunrise, broke ice from the water troughs, fed the horses, and worked until darkness swallowed the valley. For 2 years, that had been enough. Then Josephine Carter's first letter arrived. Now nothing felt quite the same. The latest letter sat folded inside his coat pocket as he saddled his bay gelding before dawn. The paper had softened from being read too many times. I should arrive in Dry Creek on December 21st, weather permitting. If the roads behave themselves, you ought to recognize me by the blue traveling coat I described. Garrett knew every word by heart. The horse snorted white steam into the freezing air. "Let's go, Scout." The ranch gate creaked behind him as he rode out into the snow. The trip to Dry Creek took more than 2 hours. The road wound through frozen meadows and narrow stands of pine. Snow squeaked beneath the horse's hooves. The sky remained the color of old tin. By the time Garrett reached town, smoke was rising from chimneys across Main Street. Dry Creek wasn't much more than a general store, a blacksmith, a boarding house, a church, and a handful of homes huddled against the cold. Still, it felt alive compared to the silence of the ranch. Garrett tied Scout outside the stage station. The station agent looked up from his ledger. "You're early." Garrett shrugged. Couldn't sit still. The old man smiled. "That's the woman from Kansas?" Garrett nodded. The agent said nothing more. Everyone in town already knew. For months, packages and letters had traveled between Wyoming Territory and Kansas. Mrs. Bell at the boarding house knew. The storekeeper knew. Even the blacksmith knew. A cowboy waiting for a woman he'd never met made for good conversation during a long winter. The afternoon dragged. Garrett drank 2 cups of coffee at the cafe beside the station. The coffee tasted burnt. He barely noticed. Every few minutes he stepped outside and looked down the road. Nothing. Then finally, shortly before sunset, someone shouted, "Stage coming!" People drifted toward the station. Garrett stepped into the snow. Far down the road, a dark shape appeared between the falling flakes. The stagecoach. His chest tightened. The horses approached first. Then the coach rolled into the square. The driver pulled hard on the reins. The team stopped. Steam rose from the animals. The door opened. A traveling salesman climbed down. Then an older couple. Then a young miner carrying a bedroll. Garrett waited. Nobody else emerged. The driver checked inside, then closed the door. That was all. The crowd began dispersing. Garrett remained where he stood. The driver noticed him. "You waiting on somebody?" "A passenger." The driver frowned. "Name?" "Josephine Carter." Recognition crossed the man's face. He climbed down from the coach. "Hold on." Garrett watched him disappear around the back. A moment later, he returned carrying a small canvas bag. "Found this after Denver." Garrett took it. The bag felt surprisingly light. The driver unfolded a creased passenger manifest. His finger moved down the page. There she is, Josephine Carter. Garrett stared at the name. The driver scratched his beard. Booked passage? That's certain. Then where is she? The man hesitated. I don't know. Garrett looked up. What do you mean you don't know? She wasn't on my coach. The words landed heavily. Cold. Simple. Wrong. Garrett took the manifest. Her name was there. No mistake. Josephine Carter. Kansas City to Wyoming Territory. He read it twice, 3 times, still the same. The driver shifted uneasily. Maybe she missed a connection somewhere. Maybe. Weather's been rough. Maybe. But something inside Garrett refused to settle. Josephine didn't sound like someone who simply changed her mind. Every letter she'd written carried certainty. Careful, thoughtful certainty. The kind that survived fear. The kind that bought a one-way ticket across half a continent. Darkness fell quickly. The town lights glowed against the snow. Garrett rode home in silence. The wind had picked up by the time he reached Cedar Bluff Ranch. The house felt colder than usual. He didn't light the lamp right away. Instead, he carried the canvas bag into the barn. The horses shifted softly in their stalls. Snow rattled against the walls. Garrett sat on an overturned bucket beneath the lantern glow. Then he opened the bag. Inside was a small Bible, a pair of gloves, a handkerchief, and several folded papers. His fingers paused on the Bible. Inside the cover was neat handwriting. Josephine Carter. To go west is to trust God with roads I cannot see. Garrett swallowed. He had never heard her voice, never seen her face. Yet suddenly she felt very close. He continued searching. Near the bottom of the bag, he found a folded sheet of paper, not a letter he recognized, not one she had mailed. The edges looked unfinished, as if it had been written in haste. He unfolded it carefully. The lantern flickered. The words were unmistakably hers. Dear Mr. Hayes, if this reaches you, then something has gone differently than either of us planned. I do not yet know what tomorrow will bring. The mountains ahead seem larger than anything I imagined. The writing continued for several paragraphs, then abruptly stopped. Garrett read the final line. Once. Then again. His stomach tightened. The sentence ended halfway across the page. If I don't reach Wyoming. Nothing followed. No signature. No explanation. No ending. Only blank paper. Outside, the winter wind howled through the darkness. Garrett sat motionless in the lantern light, staring at the unfinished sentence while snow drifted against the barn doors. For the first time since morning, a thought entered his mind that he could not push away. Something had happened to Josephine Carter, and somewhere beyond the mountains, buried beneath all that snow, the answer was waiting. The next morning, Garrett was already in the saddle before daylight reached the valley. The unfinished letter rested inside his coat pocket. He had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same sentence. If I don't reach Wyoming. The words followed him through the cold. A pale sun rose behind the clouds as he rode back toward Dry Creek. Snow crunched beneath Scout's hooves. The town was only beginning to wake when Garrett reached the stage station. The station agent looked up from his desk. You back already? I need records. The old man sighed. Thought you might. For nearly an hour, Garrett studied manifests, freight receipts, and route schedules spread across a scarred wooden table. Names, dates, stops, weather delays, most led nowhere. One note caught his attention. A severe storm warning issued 3 weeks earlier along the Elk Ridge route, the same route Josephine would have traveled. Garrett folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. By noon, he was speaking with anyone who might remember something. Drivers, store owners, stable hands, travelers passing through. Most shrugged. Some couldn't remember. Others remembered only pieces. A woman at a boarding house recalled seeing a passenger matching Josephine's description in Cheyenne. A freight clerk remembered helping a woman carry a canvas bag onto a connecting coach. A blacksmith recalled hearing about roads being closed near the mountains. Small fragments. Nothing complete. Still, Garrett kept going. Late that afternoon, he stopped at a roadside inn nearly 30 miles west of Dry Creek. The owner, a heavy-set man named Walter Briggs, wiped a glass with a towel while listening. When Garrett mentioned the Elk Ridge route, Walter stopped polishing. "You talking about that wreck?" Garrett looked up. "What wreck?" The room suddenly felt quieter. Walter set down the glass. 3 weeks ago. He nodded toward the window. "Biggest snowstorm I've seen in years." Garrett waited. A passenger coach went missing near Devil's Pass. The words hung in the air. Missing? Found part of it later. Walter shook his head. Road gave way above a ravine. Garrett felt his stomach tighten. How many survived? The innkeeper stared into his coffee cup. Most folks figured nobody did. Outside, wind rattled the windows. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Garrett asked quietly, "Most folks?" Walter looked at him. Rumors started afterward. What kind of rumors? The innkeeper hesitated. One trapper claimed he saw a woman walking south from the wreck site. Garrett leaned forward. A woman. That's what he said. Did he describe her? Walter nodded slowly. Young. Another pause. Black woman. Garrett's heart hammered once. Hard. Then again. For the first time since Josephine disappeared, hope pushed through the fear. Not certainty, not proof, but something. A trail, a possibility. That evening, Garrett rented a room upstairs. The room smelled faintly of wood smoke and lamp oil. Snow tapped against the window. He unfolded a map of the territory across the bed. Devil's Pass. Elk Ridge. The route cut through some of the roughest country in the region. Steep slopes, dense timber, deep ravines, miles of wilderness. He traced the road with one finger. If Josephine had survived, she would have been alone. In winter, in those mountains. The thought refused to leave him. Hours later, long after the lamps downstairs had been extinguished, Garrett finally slept. Far away, beyond Elk Ridge, Josephine Carter remembered the moment everything changed. The coach had been rocking through the mountains when the storm arrived. Wind screamed across the ridges. Snow struck the windows so hard it sounded like handfuls of gravel. Passengers fell silent. The driver shouted commands outside. The horses struggled. Then came a violent jolt, a cracking sound. The coach lurched sideways. Someone screamed. Luggage crashed from the overhead rack. The world tilted. For one terrible second, Josephine felt weightless. Then darkness. When she opened her eyes again, snow was blowing through shattered wood. People were shouting. Some were injured. Others were already stumbling away into the storm, searching for shelter. Her ankle burned with pain. She tried standing. Failed. Tried again. The cold bit through her gloves, through her coat, through everything. The mountains around her had vanished behind sheets of white. She could barely see 20 feet ahead. A man shouted something she couldn't hear. Then another gust swallowed the sound. The survivors scattered in different directions. Josephine took a step, then another, limping, alone, trying to stay upright against the storm. The wind erased every track behind her almost immediately. Back at the inn, Garrett slept unaware of what had truly happened that day in the mountains, but by sunrise, he knew where he was heading next. Devil's Pass, the place where the trail had vanished, and perhaps the place where it would begin again. 3 days later, snow drifted across a broken fence high above the Elk Ridge Road. A torn piece of blue fabric fluttered against the wood. Waiting for someone to notice. Waiting for someone who refused to stop looking. The strip of blue fabric snapped in the mountain wind. Garrett pulled Scout to a stop and stared at it. Snow drifted across the broken fence line. Pine trees covered the slope below. Beyond them, the white ridges of Elk Ridge stretched toward a gray horizon. He dismounted slowly. The cloth was frozen stiff along one edge. Carefully, he worked it loose from a splintered rail. The embroidery was faded, but still visible. J.C. For a long moment, he simply stood there. The wind moved through the pines. Somewhere in the distance, a raven called. Josephine had been here. Not a rumor, not a guess, not a hope. She had survived the wreck and made it this far. Garrett folded the scarf and tucked it inside his coat beside her unfinished letter. Then he kept riding. The mountains grew harsher with every mile. Roads became narrow trails. Trails disappeared beneath drifts. Twice, Scout nearly lost footing crossing frozen creek beds. One afternoon, Garrett found shelter inside an abandoned sheep shed. The roof leaked snow through several cracks. He built a small fire inside an old iron stove and heated coffee in a blackened tin pot. His gloves steamed beside the flames. He unfolded his map. The scarf had been found south of Devil's Pass. If Josephine had continued moving, she would have needed shelter. Any shelter, a cabin, a hunting shack, an abandoned mining camp. Somewhere. The next morning he rode again. By the 4th day, clouds thickened overhead. Snow began falling before noon. Large flakes drifted between the trees. The world became quiet. Near dusk, Garrett spotted smoke rising through the forest. He followed it. The cabin belonged to a man named Silas Morgan. The old hunter answered the door holding a lantern. His beard was white, his eyes sharp. "You look half frozen." Garrett gave a tired smile. "I've felt worse." Silas stepped aside. "Come in before you prove it." The cabin smelled of venison stew and wood smoke. A kettle hissed softly above the stove. Garrett explained everything while warming his hands around a chipped coffee mug. The letters, the missing stagecoach, the scarf, Josephine. Silas listened without interruption. Finally, he nodded. "I remember the storm. Everyone did. Worst one I've seen in 20 years. Garrett looked up. "Think someone could have survived?" Silas poked at the fire. "Depends on the person." The answer stayed with Garrett long after he'd sat down that night beneath a wool blanket near the hearth. Depends on the person. Far away, Josephine sat beside a different fire. A much weaker one. The abandoned mining cabin barely held together. Wind slipped through gaps in the walls. Snow gathered against the windows. The stack of firewood beside the door had grown dangerously small. Her ankle remained swollen. Walking hurt. Standing hurt. Even sleeping hurt. Still, every morning she forced herself up. Every morning she added another mark to the calendar page she had pinned beside the table. She had lost count of how many days had passed since the accident. The loneliness weighed more heavily than the cold. One evening she opened her carpet bag and removed paper, ink, and the letters Garrett had sent over the past months. She read them again. The stories about Cedar Bluff Ranch, the stubborn mare that kicked over feed buckets, the cottonwood tree near the creek, the way sunrise touched the Absaroka peaks during winter. Small things, ordinary things, the kind that made a place feel real. When she finished reading, she took up her pen. The cabin was silent except for the crackle of the fire. Dear Garrett, I don't know if this letter will ever leave this mountain. The ink trembled slightly as she wrote. But writing to you makes the room feel less empty. She paused. Outside, snow slid from the roof. Then she continued. Back on the trail, Garrett and Silas spent the next 2 days searching old trapper routes and abandoned mining roads. Late on the third afternoon, Silas suddenly raised one hand. There. Garrett followed his gaze. A weather-beaten structure stood among a cluster of snow-covered pines. A cabin. His pulse quickened. Both men urged their horses forward. The cabin looked abandoned. One shutter hung crooked. Part of the chimney had collapsed. Snow covered the roof. Garrett jumped down before Scout had fully stopped. He reached the door, pushed it open. The hinges groaned. Inside, cold air greeted him. Silence. No fire. No movement. No voice. Nothing. The room was empty. Garrett's shoulders slowly lowered. For several seconds he stood motionless. Then something caught his eye. A sheet of paper resting on a wooden table. He crossed the room and picked it up. The handwriting was unmistakable. Josephine's. His fingers tightened around the page. The letter wasn't old. The ink remained dark. Fresh enough. Very fresh. He read the first line. Then the date. 3 days earlier. Only 3 days. Garrett's heart began pounding. She had been here. Recently. Very recently. He looked around the empty room again. This time he noticed something else. A second chair slightly pulled away from the table. Extra footprints near the doorway. Signs someone else had entered after her. Silas stepped inside behind him. What is it? Garrett slowly lowered the letter. Snow drifted through the open doorway behind them. The fading sunlight stretched across the floorboards. His voice barely rose above a whisper. She survived. Silas nodded. Garrett stared at the empty room, then at the letter, then at the tracks disappearing beyond the cabin. A terrible new question settled into the silence. Josephine had left this place 3 days ago, but she hadn't left alone. The tracks outside the cabin were faint beneath fresh snow, yet they were still there. A pair of sled runners, several boot prints, signs of movement heading east. Garrett crouched beside them while cold wind swept across the clearing. Someone had found Josephine. The question was who, and whether she had left willingly. Silas studied the marks beside him. Not many folks travel these mountains in winter. Garrett looked up. You know where they lead? The old hunter nodded toward the distant ridge. Only settlement on that side is Pine Ridge, a small town hidden beyond the mountains. 2 days away in good weather, 3 in bad. Garrett was already turning toward Scout. They left before sunrise the next morning. The journey across the range tested both men and horses. Snow covered most of the old trails. Several times they lost the sled marks entirely, then found them again near creek crossings or windbreaks. At night they slept wherever shelter could be found. Once inside an abandoned trapping hut. Once beneath a rocky overhang where the fire barely stayed lit. Garrett carried Josephine's latest letter inside his coat. Every evening he unfolded it. Not to read. He already knew every word. Just to remind himself she was still somewhere ahead. Still alive. On the afternoon of the third day, Pine Ridge finally appeared below them. A scattering of buildings surrounded by snow-covered pasture land. Smoke rose from chimneys. Children crossed the main street pulling a sled. Church bells echoed faintly through the cold air. The sight of ordinary life felt strange after weeks in the wilderness. Garrett and Silas stopped first at the general store. The owner listened carefully, then pointed toward a boarding house near the far end of town. "You looking for the woman from the mountains?" Garrett froze. The owner nodded. "Family of sheep ranchers brought her in about a week ago." For a moment, Garrett could not speak. The room seemed suddenly smaller, warmer, louder. She was here. Not a rumor, not a trail, not a possibility. Here. He left the store before the man finished speaking. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he crossed the street. The boarding house sat beside a small clinic. A lantern burned near the front porch. Garrett climbed the steps slowly. His heart felt heavier than it had during the entire journey. The woman who answered the door was elderly. When Garrett explained why he had come, her expression softened. "She's resting upstairs." He removed his hat. "May I see her?" The woman studied him for a moment, then nodded, quietly. The hallway smelled faintly of medicine and wood smoke. Floorboards creaked beneath his boots. At the end of the hall stood a partially open door. Garrett stopped there. For weeks he had imagined this moment, hundreds of times. None of those versions matched reality. Josephine sat beside a window. A blanket rested across her lap. The afternoon light fell across her face. She looked thinner than he expected, more tired. One ankle was wrapped in clean bandages. A book rested in her hands. When she heard the floorboard creak, she looked up. Their eyes met, neither spoke. The room remained completely still. Garrett noticed small details first. The loose strand of hair near her cheek, the ink stain on one finger, the worn edge of the Bible resting beside her chair. Josephine noticed details too. The weathered coat, the frost still clinging to his boots, the tiredness around his eyes. Proof of how far he had traveled. The silence stretched. Not uncomfortable. Just real, like two people trying to place a familiar voice with a face for the first time. Finally, Josephine spoke. Her voice was softer than he imagined. "You found me." Garrett swallowed. "Looks like I did." A faint smile appeared, then disappeared again. The conversation came slowly after that. Not because they lacked words, because there were too many. Weeks of fear. Months of letters. An entire winter sitting between them. Garrett never mentioned the storms. Josephine never described the worst nights in the cabin. Neither seemed eager to reopen those wounds. Instead, they spoke about ordinary things. The trip, the town, the weather, coffee, the sheep ranch family who had rescued her. Small things. Human things. As evening settled over Pine Ridge, Garrett rose to leave. Josephine glanced toward the window. Snow had begun falling again. "You really rode all the way out here?" Garrett looked at her. For a second, he almost laughed, as if there had ever been another choice. "I did." She lowered her eyes briefly. A tiny movement, barely noticeable, but it stayed with him. 3 weeks later, after Josephine regained enough strength to travel, Garrett brought her home to Cedar Bluff Ranch. The ranch looked exactly as it always had. The long fence lines, the red barn, the creek winding through frozen pasture. Yet everything felt different. Josephine stood quietly beside the front gate. The wind lifted the edge of her coat. Garrett watched her take in the view. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. For the first time, both of them were standing inside the future they had only imagined through letters. But beyond the ranch fences, trouble was already waiting. In Dry Creek, whispers began spreading. Questions, rumors, doubts. And in an office overlooking the town square, banker Harold Briggs opened a ledger and ran one finger down a column of unpaid figures. When he reached Garrett Hayes's name, he smiled. A slow smile, the kind that never meant good news, because the greatest danger facing Cedar Bluff Ranch was no longer hidden in the mountains. It was written in black ink on a sheet of paper, and it was due in less than 3 months. The notice arrived on a windy March afternoon. Garrett found it folded beneath the door of the Dry Creek Bank. The paper was crisp, the handwriting precise. The message itself was short. The remaining balance on Cedar Bluff Ranch would come due at the end of June. Failure to pay would result in foreclosure and public auction. Garrett stood on the boardwalk outside the bank reading it twice, then a third time. Across the street, a freight wagon rattled past. Someone laughed outside the barber shop. Life continued as if nothing had happened, yet everything suddenly felt different. Back at Cedar Bluff Ranch, he placed the notice inside a drawer and said nothing, at least for a few days. But Josephine noticed. She noticed when he stopped lingering over supper, when he spent longer hours checking fences that didn't need checking, when he sat silently on the porch after dark with a coffee cup growing cold beside him. One evening she found him studying account books beneath a kerosene lamp. The pages looked like a foreign language, columns of numbers, feed costs, equipment repairs, loan payments. Garrett rubbed a hand across his face. Josephine quietly sat opposite him. "How bad is it?" He didn't answer immediately. Finally, he slid the notice across the table. She read it once, then folded it neatly. Neither spoke for several moments. The lamp flame flickered softly between them. "I should have told you sooner," Garrett said. Josephine shook her head. "You just did. No blame. No accusation, only a simple truth." The next morning, she asked where he kept the rest of the records. For the first time, Garrett looked almost embarrassed. "Most of them are somewhere." "Somewhere?" "In boxes." She smiled despite herself. Within 2 days, the ranch kitchen looked like a bookkeeping office. Receipts covered the table. Feed invoices, tax records, store accounts, old contracts. Josephine organized everything into neat stacks. By week's end, she knew more about Cedar Bluff's finances than Garrett ever had. Gradually, small improvements followed. Missed payments were collected. Supply orders were reduced. Expenses were tracked. Nothing dramatic. Just dozens of ordinary decisions made carefully, the kind that slowly changed the direction of a life. Spring arrived late that year. Snow lingered on the mountain peaks while green grass returned to the valley. As the weather improved, Josephine began helping children from nearby homesteads learn reading and writing in the church hall. 3 children became 6. 6 became 12. Parents who once viewed her as a stranger now greeted her by name. Change came quietly, one conversation at a time, one act of kindness at a time. Even so, the debt remained, and Harold Briggs never stopped reminding them. Every visit to town seemed to bring another warning, another deadline, another suggestion that Garrett should sell while he still could. One afternoon, Harold stopped him outside the feed store. "You know how this ends." Garrett loaded a sack into his wagon. "Do I?" "The ranch goes to auction." Harold brushed dust from his sleeve. "Unless someone smarter buys it first." Garrett simply climbed onto the wagon. The banker waited for a reaction. None came. The silence irritated him more than any argument could have. June arrived, the final month. The valley shimmered beneath warm sunlight. Wildflowers appeared along the creek, yet tension lingered beneath everything. Then, less than 2 weeks before the auction date, a familiar rider appeared at Cedar Bluff Ranch. Silas Morgan. His old horse moved slowly through the front gate, A weathered canvas bag hung from the saddle horn. Garrett met him beside the barn. "What brings you down?" Silas dismounted carefully. "Found something." He handed over the bag. The canvas looked worn from months of weather. Garrett frowned. "Where?" "Near the wreck site." Josephine stepped onto the porch as Garrett loosened the drawstring. The contents spilled onto the table inside the house. A scarf, a small notebook, several folded letters. Josephine froze. She recognized them immediately. Letters she had written inside the mining cabin. Letters never mailed. Letters never meant for anyone to find. The room grew quiet. Garrett picked up the final envelope. His name appeared on the front, written in Josephine's hand. She looked down, suddenly interested in the grain of the table. "You can read it," she said softly. No one spoke while he unfolded the pages. The letter was longer than the others, written during one of the coldest nights of the winter. Garrett read slowly. The room seemed to disappear around him. She had written about fear, about loneliness, about listening to storms strike the cabin walls, about wondering whether morning would come. Then came the passage that made him stop. Not because the words were complicated, because they were simple. She wrote that every time she considered giving up, she remembered the man waiting beyond the mountains, a man she had never met, a man who wrote about horses, fences, coffee, and sunrise, a man who unknowingly gave her a reason to keep walking. Garrett lowered the letter. No speech followed, no grand declaration. The silence itself said enough. Across the table, Josephine finally looked up. Their eyes met. Neither looked away. Outside, wind moved gently through the cottonwoods. Days later, something unexpected happened. Word spread through Dry Creek, then through neighboring ranches. People began arriving. One neighbor offered hay, another offered labor. The church organized a collection. Families contributed what they could. Some gave money, others gave supplies. Even children donated coins saved in jars. The amount wasn't large at first. Then it grew and grew. Until finally, on the morning the auction was supposed to begin, Garrett walked into Harold Briggs's office carrying enough to save Cedar Bluff Ranch. The banker counted twice, then a third time. The debt was paid, completely. By the following summer, the valley looked different, not because the mountains had changed, or the ranch, but because the people within it had. Beneath a clear Wyoming sky, friends and neighbors gathered near the meadow below the Absaroka Range. Wildflowers swayed in the breeze. Simple wooden chairs lined the grass. Garrett stood waiting. Josephine walked toward him. No storm, no fear, no mountains separating them, only sunlight, and the life they had spent months finding. Many in attendance remembered the winter when everyone assumed she was gone. Some remembered the cowboy who refused to stop searching. Yet the truth was larger than either story. Garrett had crossed mountains to find Josephine. But long before that happened, Josephine had already been traveling toward him, through snow, through doubt, through every impossible mile. In the end, neither of them had rescued the other alone. They had reached each other from opposite sides of the same winter, and that made all the difference. Sometimes I think that's what stays with us long after a story ends. Not the snowstorm, not the lost stagecoach, not even the miles Garrett rode through the mountains. It's the simple thought that somewhere out there, another person might be holding on for the very same reason you're trying to keep going. Imagine yourself standing where Garrett once stood, the wind cutting across the Wyoming plains. A letter in your hand, no certainty, no promise, just a quiet belief that someone matters enough to keep moving forward. Or maybe you're more like Josephine, facing a season that feels longer than it should, looking at another difficult morning and wondering if you have the strength for one more day. What this story reminds me is that healing rarely arrives all at once. Sometimes it comes through small acts of faith, a letter, a kind word, a person who refuses to forget you, a reason to take the next step when the road ahead disappears beneath the snow. Love isn't always found in grand speeches. Sometimes it's found in persistence, in waiting, in showing up, in choosing not to give up on another human being. I'd love to know your thoughts. Which moment in Garrett and Josephine's journey stayed with you the most? And if stories like this bring you a little comfort at the end of the day, I hope you'll stay a while. There are many more journeys waiting ahead, stories of resilience, mystery, second chances, and the quiet ways people change each other's lives when they need it most. Until the next story, take care of yourself, and keep believing that even the longest winter eventually leads somewhere worth reaching.